Hey y'all, today we'll be starting on chapter 10, which is intelligence. I think this is one of the most interesting chapters in this book, so I hope you guys will enjoy it as much as I do.
Okay, so chapter 10 information. We're going to start off, there's a number of theories we're going to talk about, but we're going to start off with Spearman's theory of general intelligence. And sometimes that is just written as the lowercase letter g. So if you ever see the lowercase letter g as an answer on the exam, know that it's referring to Spearman's general intelligence. And the idea here is just that every person has an underlying level of intelligence. That's all that Spearman is saying, is there is some underlying level of intelligence that we all have. Some people have a higher level of intelligence, some people have a lower one, but we all have a characteristic level of intelligence that belongs to us. And this is measured by every single task on an intelligence test. So basically, and as we're about to talk about, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, the controversy here is Spearman says intelligence is just one thing. Whether you're measuring, spatial ability or verbal ability or mathematical ability, it doesn't matter. Everyone has an underlying intelligence level ability. Whereas other theories like Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences says, no, there are multiple different types of intelligence, and you can be very intelligent in one type and not very intelligent in another type. But that's a very different concept than saying everyone is a characteristic level of intelligent, and it doesn't really move around. So that's Spearman's theory. As we talk about savant syndrome, I want you to understand that you should always link savant syndrome with Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Savant syndrome shows really good support for Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And this is because savant syndrome refers to a condition where someone has a very low mental ability in general, but they have one talent or one skill that they just absolutely excel at. And I mean, this can be ridiculous. Like, there are cases of people with savant syndrome who would fly over the entire city and be able to draw a 2-scale replica of the whole city after only seeing it once. That's insane, right? Like, we can never hope to do something like that. But at the end of the day, savant syndrome is overall low intelligence, but one exceptional skill. And so for someone to be so low in intelligence in so many ways and then to be so intelligent in one way really kind of shows support that intelligence is just not one thing. It can be shown in a variety of different ways and different types of measurements. And that's what Gardner has argued. We'll get into all of these intelligence theories in just a couple slides too. But the next one would be Sternberg's 3 intelligences. It's also called the triarchic theory. Remember, anytime we see TRI, the prefix, it means 3, right? So the 3 intelligences for Sternberg are analytical, creative, and practical. Analytical intelligence has to do with problem solving, logic, goal-directed intelligence, and it mostly has to do with the type of stuff that you're learning in school. Those sorts of tasks, math problems or like reading response questions or things like that. That's all analytical intelligence. Creative intelligence is all about divergent thinking. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 9. Divergent thinking and innovation. How able are you to come up with something new? A new idea that other people haven't purported before. How creative are you? And then lastly, practical intelligence. And next to this, I want you to write down the words street smarts. Street smarts. That is practical intelligence. Practical intelligence is just your street smarts and your social smarts. It's good for everyday practical problems that you encounter. So, you're walking to class and you realize that you left your book in your dorm, for example. So you would use your practical intelligence to decide what to do. I only have 5 minutes left before class. I'm not going to be able to make it back to my dorm, so either I skip class or I go to class without my book. If I go to class without my book, what are the consequences to that? Will I get docked points? So that's all your practical intelligence is just anytime you run into a day-to-day issue that you have to solve, that's what you're using practical intelligence for. Okay. And then we've got emotional intelligence. There are 4 components to this, and that's perceiving emotions, understanding emotions, managing emotions, and using emotions. I would just kind of vaguely know what each of these is discussing. But at the end of the day, the only kind of test question I really see coming out of this is which of the following is not one of the 4 components of emotional intelligence, right? And so she might give you 3 of these, and you would have to identify which, she's going to give you a 4th. You have to identify which one is wrong, right? Okay. Okay, so now here we are at all of these theories, and don't feel like you have to write a lot down for these. I would just basically write down what's in the summary box in your own words. So like I said, Spearman's general intelligence is there's one underlying intelligence for every single person. Thirstone, which we don't really talk about a lot, Thirstone will almost never be an answer to anything. But really the only thing you need to know about Thirstone's primary mental abilities is that he says there are 7 types of intelligence. 7 groups of intelligence. Gardner says there are 8 or 9. Now, most frequently we use 8 when we're talking about Gardner. But that's, Gardner's much more popular and much more common to talk about than Thirstone, but just know that Thirstone is 7, Gardner is 8 different types of intelligence that they have cataloged. Triarchic theory, like I said, tri means 3, right? So this is that 3-part intelligence idea: analytical, creative, and practical. And then emotional intelligence. What I want you to write down for this question is the number of intelligences for each of these. So I should see a 1 next to Spearman, 7 next to Thirstone, 8 Gardner, 3 Sternberg, 4 emotional intelligence. 1, 7, 8, 3, 4. Okay. So achievement tests versus aptitude tests. Achievement tests are going to be tests for what you have already learned and retained. So it's a test that's trying to measure how well you have learned something that you have been taught. So any exam that you ever take in college is going to be an achievement test. You should have already learned this information. How much of it do you know and remember? That's what an achievement test is doing. An aptitude test is trying to predict how you will do in the future at something, practically. And so an aptitude test really measures your ability to learn the required elements, which of course, is kind of a tricky thing. How do you test that, right? And so aptitude tests are typically used for things like apprenticeships or sort of other technical jobs, where they might bring you in to do like a practical component where they give you some sort of, let's say you're going in for like an electrician apprenticeship, for example. They might give you like a broken circuit and ask you to rewire it so that it works, right? That should be something you haven't done before, but with aptitude tests, it's difficult because how do you know when someone has encountered something before versus when they haven't? But with an aptitude test, the information that they're being tested on should be new information. It should be something they've already learned, and it should be predicting how you're going to be doing in the future. If you think about it, the SAT and the ACT are supposed to be aptitude tests, but if you really consider the types of questions that they're asking you within the test, they require background information, no? So SAT and ACT tests, while they are categorized as aptitude tests, they function a little more like achievement tests. In any case, know that an intelligence test is supposed to be an aptitude test. An intelligence test is supposed to be an aptitude test. It's supposed to predict your future performance, in life or in school based on your intelligence capacity. But intelligence tests are not very accurate or reliable, and we'll talk about why when we get into the second half of this worksheet. Okay. Don't feel like you have to write a lot down here. For Francis Galton, just know that he tried to make an assessment, but it didn't work. Nonetheless, this is kind of where intelligence test development began, so he was a cornerstone in that sense that he started the first assessment of intelligence, but like I said, it didn't work. So we had to do more work after him. Okay, Alfred Binet was asked to make some kind of intelligence test in France. And so his idea was that if I have, let's say, a 12-year-old child who is dull, who is not very intelligent, then they'll likely perform on the intelligence test as if they were a 7 or 8-year-old, an average 7 or 8-year-old, right? They're going to score like a typical younger child, whereas a bright student, so someone who's 12 years old and very smart, might score like a 16 or 17-year-old on the exam. And so this is that idea of mental age. How smart are you mentally, right? Not what age are you physically, but what age are you mentally. And so know that Alfred Binet is the one that came up with the concept of the mental age. And this is important because it's going to lead us to the IQ test. So Louis Terman was a professor at Stanford University, and Binet's original French intelligence test was for only French school children. And so at Stanford, they asked Louis Terman to come up with an intelligence test that was similar to Binet's test, but for Americans. So he came up with what is called the Stanford Binet, and that's the most widely used American revision of Binet's original intelligence test. And then based on that, we were able to derive the IQ test, the intelligence quotient, which is the ratio of your mental age over your chronological age multiplied by 100. So let's think about that. If your mental age and your chronological age match, if I'm 22 years old and I perform like the average 22-year-old on an intelligence test, 22 over 22 is 1 times 100 gives me 100, which is exactly what you should be making on an IQ test. That just means that you're developing properly, essentially. My mental age is the same as my physical age is the good thing. Getting anything above a 100 would show that your mental age is higher than your physical age, and getting anything below a 100 would show that your mental age is lower than your chronological age. And then we have David Wechsler, and what you really need to know is that he created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS, and that is the most widely used intelligence test. Write this down, that the WAIS is the most widely used intelligence test. Most people think it's the IQ test because that's what they've heard of, the most before, but that is not the most widely used. Okay, when it comes to standardization, every single new test that's developed has got to be standardized. We've got to bring in a group of people for a pre-test and figure out how people are scoring on this test, make any adjustments to the test that need to be made, and then we can put out a final version of that test to the public. And so that's what standardization is all about, is bringing in a group of people to pre-test in order to figure out what is wrong with the test and what's good with the test. And so during standardization, what you're essentially doing is actually creating the normal curve. So when you bring in a bunch of people to take your new test, you need to keep bringing them in all the way until you have a normal curve on your test. And that's when it's been standardized, when your data has reached a normal curve. All right, next we're going to be talking about reliability and validity, which is super important. So make sure that you know the difference between reliability and validity like the back of your hand. Reliability is all about consistency. When you retest someone, do they get the same score or approximately the same score on a test, or do you get varied data that's just all over the place? If I'm trying to give an intelligence test and I have one person take the test or different variations of test 4 or 5 times, and the first time they scored an 80, and then they scored 160, and then they scored a 40, well, that's not reliable at all. These scores are all over the place. So reliability, think about even just the word reliability. If you have a reliable coworker, what does that mean? It means that they're consistent, right? It means that you can expect that they're going to show up to work and they're going to do their job, right? So next to reliability, I want you to write down the word consistency. Consistency. It's all about retesting and seeing if results are consistent. Validity, on the other hand, is about correctness. Write that down, correctness or accuracy. Correctness or accuracy. So for validity, there are a couple different types that we're going to talk about. Content and predictive. So let's say that I'm going to try to devise an assessment of aggression. I want to figure out how aggressive someone is. So when it comes to content validity, this is just saying that the test that I'm giving should have something to do with what it is I'm trying to measure, right? So if I'm trying to measure aggression, I shouldn't be asking questions like, what's your favorite color? What did you eat for dinner last night? How many pets do you have? Because these things theoretically should have nothing to do with someone's level of aggressiveness, right? So for something to be content valid, it needs to measure what we're actually trying to measure. So I would want to ask questions like, how often do you feel angry? How frequently do you yell at your friends and family? Have you ever punched a hole in a wall, right? Questions like this that are actually relevant to what it is I'm trying to measure. That's what content validity speaks to, that the content of your test is going to match what you're actually trying to measure. Predictive validity has to do with how successfully a test can predict behavior. And this can be difficult. Because let's say that we have someone who is really aggressive. Characteristically, they are an angry person. They are aggressive all the time, right? And so when I give them my aggression assessment, they're absolutely going to score very high on that. But let's say that this particular person knows that they have an issue with aggression, and so they've been to, therapy for that. They've gone to anger management classes or something of that nature. Well, then my test is not going to have a lot of predictive validity because they know better than to act on those aggressive urges. So predictive validity can be tricky, but generally if we're predicting something that doesn't change or is characteristic of a person won't change, then we can see higher predictive validity scores for that. Okay. In the past, we've talked about cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, but really what you need to know is that a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study both have the same goal of trying to figure out how people change throughout the course of their life. How do things change with age? And so for a cross-sectional study, I would take a group of people who are between the ages of 10 to 20. I take another group of people who are between 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40 and 50, right? And I give them all the same test or the same assessment. And we figure out, particularly relating to this chapter, how intelligence is changing with age. How do people in the 80 to 90 group score compared to the 30s to 40s, compared to the 10 to 20, right? Whereas a longitudinal study would take people from their birth and follow them throughout the whole course of their life and measure that same individual person and figure out how their own intelligence has changed throughout the course of their life. Okay, you definitely want to know about crystallized and fluid intelligence. A cohort is just a group of people that share something in common. So you could have, a cohort of psychology students, you could have a cohort of females, you could have a cohort of people who like EDM, I don't know, anything. A group of people who have something in common. So for crystallized and fluid intelligence is essentially the gathering of facts and knowledge. It's almost like declarative memory. And that does tend to increase with age. So we talk about older people being wiser. This is because they've crystallized and collected all of this intelligence that they've crystallized as they've gotten older. Fluid intelligence, though, refers to essentially abstract reasoning and problem solving. And that is something that decreases with age. You're always going to see more fluid intelligence within younger people, particularly peaking between, I think it's 20 and 28 or something like that. But when it comes to like quick reasoning and problem solving and thinking on your feet, that's all fluid intelligence, and that decreases with age. Okay. So there's a correlation that we know exists between intelligence and health. And so this section of the textbook is just trying to explain some possible reasons why that correlation exists, but we don't actually know definitively why more intelligent people are also more healthy. But here are a few theories. Number one, if you're more intelligent, then you're going to go on to get more education, a better job, and therefore live in a healthier environment. Number two, intelligence encourages healthy living. So if you're smart, you'll know that smoking cigarettes will hurt you, and so you'll avoid doing that unhealthy behavior. because people who are smart, right, should want to do things that are good for their health. Next, prenatal events or early childhood illnesses may have influenced both intelligence and health. So this is the idea of a confounding variable, that there's something, some kind of third variable, in this case it would be prenatal events, the nutrition that you got while you were in the womb, or perhaps if your mother, say, drank alcohol while you were in the womb, that would affect your intelligence for sure. But these prenatal influences or events not only affect your intelligence, but they also determine your health. That's another theory. And lastly, a well-wired body, meaning someone who has like a fast reaction speed, perhaps fosters both intelligence and longevity, meaning living for a long time. Okay. The rest of this worksheet is a lot of just summary and cataloging, so don't feel like you have to write everything down, please. But I will just kind of go over this as a summary more for you. So when we're talking about extremes of intelligence, the low extreme is what we call intellectual disability. This used to be called mental retardation. We no longer use that term. It's been taken out of every material ever because it's offensive. So we now say intellectual disability. And know that in order to be categorized as someone with an intellectual disability, that is an IQ score of 70 or below. 70 or below. Write that down. 70 or below. There are two criteria to qualify as someone with an intellectual disability. One, they have to be in the lowest 3% of the general population on an intelligence test. So when you're looking at your normal curve, you cut off that point where the bottom 3% are, and if the person that you're looking at lies within that 3%, then they qualify as having an intellectual disability. And the second criteria is that they have to have difficulty adapting to normal demands of independent living in 3 areas. These areas are really not that important. A low intelligence test score can be a really big deal. It can mean life or death for some criminals. People who score lower than 70 cannot be executed because it's considered cruel and unusual punishment. So that's kind of interesting, especially if you're thinking about, someone who's trying to plead insanity when they're not actually insane. What are the chances that they would be able to fake a low score on an intelligence test and get out of the death penalty on a false claim? The high extreme, so people who are considered to be gifted, are those people who score above 135 on an intelligence test. So write that down as well. Intellectually gifted is 135 or above. I don't know why it's not evenly distributed. Like, I would think that it would be 30 points up or 30 points down, like intellectual disability 70 or below, giftedness 130 or above, but that's not the case. So just know 70 and 135 are your key points there. However, gifted child programs tend to actually segregate high-scoring children in special classes, and it gives them academic enrichment that's not available to their peers. So when we're doing this, when we're labeling people as, intellectually ungifted versus gifted, and then we proceed to give those gifted people even more opportunities to learn, you're just further separating the gap, is what we've noticed. When we give these gifted students so many more resources, they get more and more and more intelligent and start doing better and better. Their confidence is skyrocketing too. And then these people we've labeled as ungifted tend to fall into patterns of self-doubt and actually do worse and worse because they don't think that they're capable of doing any better. And then know also that we often see minority and low-income youth being placed in those low academic groups. So when we track them, that can actually promote segregation and prejudice on the basis of this idea of inferior intelligence. Okay. When it comes to genetic effects, we see that identical twins score very, very similarly. Heritability of intelligence is about 50 to 80%. And that's really kind of the most important stuff. Also know that intelligence is polygenetic, meaning that there are many genes involved in intelligence. We have not been able to isolate intelligence down to one gene or anything like that. That would be horribly simplistic. When it comes to environmental effects, When we see environments vary widely, meaning that they're very, very different, people who are in poverty versus people who are the children of millionaires, right? Environmental differences are more predictive of intelligence test scores than genetic effects. But in environments that are relatively equal, genetic effects tend to have a larger impact on intelligence level. Adoption enhances intelligence scores of mistreated or neglected children, or children who came from poverty and then were adopted into middle-income homes. So as we see, life conditions improve, we see intelligence improve as well. And then intelligence scores of same-age unrelated siblings adopted as infants. That's kind of a lot. What we're saying is you're adopting two children who are not related at all, so now they come into the home and they are siblings, but they're not biologically siblings. So when we test these people, they tend to correlate 0.28, which is a modest correlation, suggesting that their shared environment, the house that they grew up in, had some effect on their intelligence level. Okay. Other environmental stuff, children who are raised in hopeless environments, meaning they were like deprived, neglected, locked up, living in squalor, or something like that, develop a very small sense of personal control over their life, and they sort of become passive, and we call this learned helplessness. When you learn that you don't have control over a situation, you sort of just give up. And that's what we're talking about here. If you were raised in a hopeless human environment, these children tend to just kind of give up, and they just become these passive lumps. It's really sad. But on the other hand, if you provide people with a really enriching environment, they actually tend to do better. So it goes both ways. We see in Iran, there was a training program implemented where language learning games were played with infants, and then soon they were able to name a whole bunch of things, and most were adopted out. So we've got to start young, even with children who are in orphanages. You have to start young to make sure that they're going to cognitively develop the way that they should. Poor environmental conditions can depress cognitive development, right? Schools with poverty-level children have less qualified teachers. As a result, lower achievement scores. That just kind of further separates that gap. And all babies should have normal exposure to sight, sounds, and speech in order to properly develop. This really kind of just comes back to that idea of the critical period, and that we have to get certain things into kids' brains before it becomes too late. Okay. So these are just some kind of early intervention programs that help in dealing with this issue and giving children early education that helps them in the future. And so we see schooling and intelligence interact, both enhance later income. So that's cool. Project Head Start was developed by the government for families below poverty line, and it increased school readiness and gave a boost to later health and high school completion. Intelligence scores also rise when pregnant mothers take nutritional supplements. So that's one of those sort of prenatal effects. If your mom is taking good nutritional supplements, or in general just has good nutrition habits while she's pregnant with you, then that can influence your intelligence. Bottom line though, both genes and experience, nature and nurture, right, are going to contribute to intelligence. It's not just one or the other. It's a combination of both. Okay. And then there's this idea of a growth mindset. A growth mindset is believing that your intelligence is something that can change or grow, and so you're going to focus your efforts on reaching that growth and betterment. Whereas a fixed mindset, which isn't mentioned in here, is the idea that intelligence is not changeable, and so you're not actively doing anything to become more intelligent because you believe that that's not possible. It just is what it is, right? So effort is an important component of success. There's a link between hard work and success. Specifically, ability, opportunity, and motivation are sort of the three components that lead to success. Notice that opportunity is a whole third of that, though, right? Repeated findings say that a growth mindset and disciplined effort enhance achievement test scores, but let's come back to that opportunity component. One downside is that a possible overemphasis on the power of positive thinking to lift people out of disadvantage is not helpful, right? We don't want people to think that they're in the situations that they're in because of something that they've done, if it in fact was not their fault at all, right? And so, yes, while part of success is your motivation and your hard work, the other parts are your ability and your opportunity. The circumstances that you're in, do they facilitate your ability to learn, to engage, or do they hinder that, right? Okay. Differences between the genders. Men tend to think that they're smarter than women, but intelligence test scores show that we are quite the same, and in fact, girls actually had 0.1 higher score than boys, so I don't know, that really doesn't say anything. It's not statistically significant. Girls tend to outperform boys in spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, that's your emotional intelligence component, and sensitivity to touch, taste, and color. Whereas boys only outperform girls in spatial ability and complex math problems. But when it comes to math computation or overall math performance, they don't differ, hardly at all. What we do see, though, and I'm going to draw you a little illustration here, is that the mental ability scores of males vary more than females, meaning that there are more males at the extremes. There are more males that are in special education and more males that score really, really high on the SAT compared to girls. So let me go over here real quick and just draw you a little sort of representation of this. So let's say this is intelligence. And over here we've got intellectual disability. Over here we've got intellectual giftedness. So remember, intellectual disability is a score of 70 or lower. Intellectual giftedness is a score of 135 or more. For boys, it's going to look something like this. And for girls, it's going to look something like this. Okay. So what that shows is that there are a lot more boys who are intellectually gifted than girls. That distance here shows that. But there are also a lot more boys who are intellectually disabled compared to girls, right? So boys vary more, and varying more just means essentially the width of the distribution. They have a larger width compared to girls. So if you're female, you're actually more likely to just be average. But if you're male, it's a toss-up. Are you going to be average, or are you going to be intellectually disabled or intellectually gifted? There's more variation. It's harder to tell, harder to predict. And then, of course, social expectations and divergent opportunities are going to shape the interests of boys and girls. We'll come back to that. Okay. So when we're talking about there being intelligence test score differences between racial and ethnic groups, there are a couple facts that everyone agrees upon. Number one, we all agree that, in fact, racial and ethnic groups do differ in their average intelligence test scores. And we see, number two, that high-scoring people are more likely to attain high levels of education and income. But the question is, why is there a difference between racial and ethnic groups? And that'll kind of be the next section that we talk about. So I'll finish going through the rest of this first. But heredity is going to contribute to individual differences, but group differences could be entirely environmental. That's a little more complex than anything you have to understand. Just know that heredity functions more when it comes to individual differences in intelligence, not group differences. And so now we're asking, that racial gap, is it a genetic thing or is it environmental? So the question, is it possible it's environmental? We have a few theories. Genetics research shows that humans are remarkably alike, regardless of your race or ethnicity. So it's unlikely it's a genetic issue. Race is not a neatly defined biological category, meaning that two different races, they're right next to one another geographically, tend to kind of blend. You can't really tell the difference between people who are geographically very close to one another, but technically are members of two different races. And this is interesting. The intelligence test performance of today's people compared to 1930s show that every single person has increased in their intelligence test scores over time, and we call that the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect. The fact that everyone today as a population on an intelligence test is going to do better than the population in the 1930s. And this is mostly just due to the fact that so much has developed at this point where we have access to so much more information at our fingertips on the internet, and so that's really what that comes down to. When blacks and whites receive the same pertinent knowledge, they exhibit similar information processing skill. Schools and culture matter, and in different eras, different ethnic groups have experienced golden ages, periods of remarkable achievement. So it's not really that, one race or ethnic group has come up with like all of these remarkable achievements. Certainly every group has come up with something, or more than just one thing, multiple things that are useful. But it just kind of happens at different times, right? Okay, so when we're talking about racial bias, there are these three camps. Number one, there are genetically disposed racial differences in intelligence. So what this camp is saying is the racial differences that we see are genetically influenced. The second camp says, no, the racial differences that we see are socially influenced. And the third camp says, look, there are some racial differences in intelligence test scores, but that's because the test itself is inappropriate or biased. There's something wrong with the test. There's not something wrong with the results that we're getting. So let's talk about, what bias means in this case then. The scientific meaning of bias is whether or not a test is valid and therefore predicts future behavior. But intelligence tests are going to be biased in the sense that they don't just test your innate abilities, but they're affected by education and experience. I really like this example. Let's say that a question is looking for a student to associate a cup with a saucer. Well, if you grew up in poverty, you've probably never seen or used a saucer. You were lucky if you had a cup, right? So you're therefore put at a disadvantage in answering the question compared to rich children. And that's not really an appropriate assessment of intelligence as much as it's a cultural measurement of experience and knowledge. And so researchers are recommending creating culture-neutral questions so that we have culture-fair tests. We're not asking people about stuff that some have experienced and others will never or have never had the opportunity to experience. And then test takers' expectations. So this is kind of interesting. Stereotype threat is this idea that someone's going to evaluate you negatively on a stereotype, and you're so anxious and so worried about that happening that your performance actually tanks because you've essentially created this own worry in your head. So let's say, there's always this idea that Asians are bad drivers. It's a common, stereotype that people have. So let's say that an Asian person goes to take their driving test, right? And so they get in the car, they're about to take their driving test, and they're thinking, gosh, I really hope that this person who's evaluating me isn't going to think that I'm a bad driver just because I'm an Asian person, And so they're nervous about this. They really want to get their license. It's important, right? And they're worried that they're going to be evaluated negatively because of their race, because of a negative stereotype. And so all of this anxiety builds up, and then when they go to do the driving test, the anxiety inhibits their performance, and they do worse, and they get a worse score than they otherwise would have. But you have to activate the stereotype in some way, right? This isn't going to happen if you're not thinking about it. It's only going to happen if you're thinking about the stereotype and being evaluated negatively, because it has to cause that anxiety, which then tanks the performance. And so as this pertains to intelligence tests, if you're worried that your group or your type doesn't often do well, your self-doubts and your self-monitoring are going to undermine your memory and impair your attention, performance, and learning. And so what we want to do is instead boost people's confidence, and that will help to increase academic achievement and success. And there's pretty good evidence for this. We've done all sorts of tests with school children where you tell one group of children, hey, you're about to take this exam. People with blue eyes do really well on this exam. People with brown eyes do really poorly. And then you tell another class of students the exact opposite information, that brown-eyed people do really well and blue-eyed people do really poorly on this test. Well, what you're actually going to see is when you get those tests back, in the group where you said blue-eyed people would do well, blue-eyed people did really well, and brown-eyed people did really poorly. But in the group where it was reversed, you get exactly opposite results. The brown-eyed people did great, and blue-eyed people did really poorly. So this does really reinforce that stereotype threat idea, that our success is in fact dependent upon our mindset and how well we think we're going to be doing, and how much anxiety really comes from threats that we could not do very well. So, all right, that's the end. Make sure to submit this to assignments under Canvas, and then also take the Chapter 10 quiz. All right, see you Monday.